offer these reflections with love to the transgender community on the Transgender Day of Remembrance. This is by no means a very complete history, but it is a history of the trans people who have inspired me. When I first started to think about who had inspired me, I thought immediately of Leslie Feinberg and the Reverend Polly Murray. I first learned of Leslie Feinberg through the book Stone Butch Blues, which came out in the 90s, and I had the privilege of meeting Leslie back then. Leslie Feinberg was a trans activist, was an activist for many social justice causes, a prolific writer, and as I said, a great inspiration to me because it was all about equality, equity, dignity, and knowing our history. Sadly, Leslie Feinberg died at age 65 from Lyme disease. The Reverend Polly Murray is another inspiration. Polly Murray was born in Baltimore but grew up being raised by her grandparents in Durham, North Carolina. She was an activist. She was an attorney, a civil rights attorney. She was a poet. And later in life, she was ordained as an Episcopal priest. And today she is on the calendar of saints for the Episcopal Church, so we can refer to her as Saint Polly Murray. Polly Murray used to say that she had an inverted sexual identity and that she wanted to be married to a woman, but as a man. And in the 1940s, very ahead of her time, she tried hormone therapy. If nothing else, I really recommend that you check out Polly Murray's poetry. It's incredibly beautiful. Transgender warriors making history from Joan of Arc to Dennis Rodman was one of Leslie Feinberg's classic books. And in it, Feinberg says, "We have not always been forced to pass, to go underground, in order to work and live. We have a right to live openly and proudly. When our lives are suppressed, everyone is denied an understanding of the rich diversity of sex and gender expression and experience that exist in human society." In the millennia before the Europeans came to what are now called the Americas, there were not two genders, there were many genders. And across the Americas, indigenous people accepted and honored people of varying genders. All of that changed with the coming of the Europeans. In the 1530s, Cabeza de Vaca crossed what is now the U.S. Southwest, and he related it in his account, La Relación, that was published in 1542. And in talking about the Coahuiltecos, the people who now live in South Texas and in the Mexican state of Coahuila, he talked about what he described as impotent, effeminate men who dress like women and who perform the work of women. But they also shot with a bow and they carried very great loads. This presence of multiple genders was of great concern to the Europeans because it didn't fit the way that they saw the world. But yet, looking back at these colonial documents, we can see glimpses of what we would think of now as transgender history. Bartolomé de las Casas was a bishop, a landowner, a writer, a priest, and in the early 1500s he began to document the Spanish atrocities against the indigenous peoples, and he published it as a way to get Spanish policy towards indigenous people changed. Several decades later, Theodore de Bry illustrated Spanish tyrannies and cruelties, cannibalism in the New World, the English translation of Bartolomé de las Casas' work, as a way to discredit Spain. Even though there was not a term for transgender back then, we can still see glimpses again of transgender history. Here's an illustration titled Hermaphrodites as Laborers. But when they talk about laborers in this case, the people they're calling hermaphrodites were caring for the sick and dying. They were healers. They were highly valued in society because of this. This second woodcut by de Bry is called Balboa's Dogs Attacking a Group of Panamanian Sodomites. Again, we don't know whether these were people that we might in modern day call gay or whether we might call them trans, but it is an illustration of the incredibly horrific treatment of people who did not fit the gender binary that the Europeans sought to impose on indigenous people. At the time of the European invasion, there were multiple ways to live your life, multiple genders that you could be and be part of society, be honored by society, as I said before, as healers, as mediators. Today, we've been able to document a little bit over 130 different names for the non-binary genders of indigenous people. You'll see some of them listed here on this slide, including the Rane, which are the third gender among the Raramuri people in Chihuahua, the Mushe, who are the third gender among the Zapotec, and I have a photo here of Wihua, who was a Zuni Lamana, a third gendered person born in 1849, who died in 1896. Wiwa took on the social and ceremonial role of a woman, although born as a male. And Wiwa was one person who provided a lot of insight into this third gender of the Zuni, being friends with an anthropologist, even visiting the White House. When conflict broke out between the Zuni and the federal government, Wihua was arrested as a witch and was sent to prison. In recent years, the Mushe from Zapotec culture have received a lot of attention. In fact, recently Vogue magazine in Mexico featured a Mushe on their cover. Mushe means woman in Zapotec and probably comes from the Spanish word mujer, but it means a third sex. People who are born male but take on the dress and the roles of women in Zapotec culture. Lucas Avendaño is a Mushe performer who does incredible work beautifully expressing that culture. In 1889, a baby girl was born, Amelia Robles Avila. At the age of 24, Amelia changed her name to Amelio, began fighting in the Mexican Revolution, and rose to the rank of colonel. Emilio Robles lived as a man for over 70 years. If anyone referred to him as a woman, he would pull out his pistol and say, "I'm a man." Coronel Emilio Robles fought with the Zapatistas and was considered a hero in the Mexican Revolution. In 1952, the New York Times ran an article with the headline, "Bronx Boy is Now a Girl." The first time that a trans woman was widely reported in the US media. Christine Jorgensen had been born as George William Jorgensen in 1926, was drafted into World War II, returned from the war, and began working. It was at that time that he learned that in Europe there were doctors doing sex reassignment surgery. So he went to Denmark, had surgery, and returned to the United States as Christine Jorgensen. On the right, the photo shows Christine Jorgensen and her fiancé on their way to get a marriage license, which was denied them. Because Jorgensen was so well known and the media covered her all the time in the 1950s, she was unable to get a job that would allow her some anonymity. So she ended up performing as her career. And still today, she's very well known. Christine Jorgensen and the media attention placed on her allowed trans people all over the United States, perhaps all over the world, to realize that they were not alone. And when her doctor's name was published in the newspaper, the doctor received hundreds of letters from people saying, "Please help me. I need that surgery." Marsha P. Johnson, Marsha Pay It No Mind Johnson, was a transgender activist, a self-described drag queen, a woman who fought against AIDS, homelessness, who lived on the streets herself, and who came first to the public eye during the Stonewall riots. Sylvia Rivera was a good friend of Marsha P. Johnson, and they were both at Stonewall during the days of the Stonewall riots. Sylvia, too, had been homeless, had been attacked for being trans. At the end of her life, unfortunately, she remained unhomed, but she remains a model for organizing, as we'll see in a second. In 1970, Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson formed STAR, the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, later renamed the Street Transgender Action Revolutionaries. And they reached out to everyone from students at New York University. You see a photo here where they are part of a protest for the NYU Gay Activist Alliance. They reached out to young people living on the streets, and they decided that it was not enough to form an organization and to participate in protests. So they got a building and they created what was called Star House, where they provided a home, where they provided meals, but probably more importantly, where they provided love to the young people living on the streets who were queer, who were transgendered, and they created an amazing alternative space in New York City. Marsha P. Johnson was found dead floating in the river, and the police called it a suicide, but her friends didn't believe it was a suicide. They believed that she was murdered. And she had been seen the night of her disappearance being harassed by a young gang of thugs. So Marsha P. Johnson, who lived life to the fullest, who was part of the gay scene in New York, the trans scene, the arts scene, who lived her life beautifully and fully, paid for that with her life. Angela Douglas was the founder of TAO, Transvestite Transsexual Activist Organization in California. You can see her in this photo with a beautiful sequined gown holding a placard. One of the issues that Angela Douglas fought for was to take transsexuality out of the category of mental disorders. And this was very, very important to helping trans people live their lives with dignity. This has been a brief overview of the bits of transgender history that I hold in my heart and that I cherish as a historian, from the ability of trans people to survive and to thrive in the face of violence and in the face of hostility, to the creativity, to the dignity that trans people show every day. I want to end with a quote from Amaranta Gomez Regalado, who is a Mushe activist and the first Mushe anthropologist. And she said, despite all the differences, despite all the challenges, to this day, Mushe dignity is untouchable. Today, on the Transgender Day of Remembrance, I want to honor all of those who came before, who fought for dignity with love.